Hi, thanks for watching the video. My name is Patrick. This channel is called What the Heaven, and it's based on the idea that it's good to ask questions. If you've ever wanted to ask a Christian something, if you've ever been too afraid to ask a question about the Bible that you feel like you shouldn't ask but you really want to know the truth, put it in the comments. I promise to make a video about it. Also, before the video starts, go ahead and click that tiny red box in the lower right corner. That's my subscribe button. It'd be great if you could find out about my next videos. Now, the question that I'm tackling today is really important because it's happening right now. I had somebody message me and ask me what Christians should do regarding the rioting and the protests because of the murder of George Floyd. This is really important, and Christians are concerned because in all four Gospels, Jesus does something really similar. He throws people out of the temple, he makes a whip, he destroys property, and Christians want to know, is that something we should be doing too? America needs change. Oppression and racism need to end. So what should we do? Whenever you read the Gospels, one of the most important things you can do is identify who Jesus is talking to. When Jesus is talking to normal people, he's usually pretty agreeable, but Jesus' harshest sayings and actions were always reserved for the religious people. All four Gospels talk about the cleansing of the temple. So let's look at the scripture. Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. So who is Jesus talking to here? Obviously, he's talking to religious people. If Jesus had done something like this in the city, in a bank, or at a marketplace in the city that was overseen by the Romans, Jesus would have been arrested and killed on the spot. We're talking about the Roman Empire.
When the Messiah comes, Rome will be nothing!
Until then.
Jesus in this story is not protesting Roman rule or society. He's actually protesting the absolute evil of the religious people in the temple. In the Old Testament, God lays out a way to help normal people support the upkeep of the temple. They called it the temple tax, surprise, and it was actually less than we normally would tithe. The temple tax was about 2 days' wages, and when people from outside Jerusalem went to celebrate a festival or a really holy day, they would pay the temple tax to enter the temple. Now, I don't think there's technically anything wrong with this. God asked for it, and they're just donating to keep the temple going. So what's the big deal? Well, it starts to get crazy. If you watched my episode about 666 and the Mark of the Beast, you know that at the time of Jesus, all countries, all empires, they used coinage that depicted their emperor. And a lot of the times, especially in the case of Caesar Augustus, the coinage actually said that the emperor was God, or the emperor was the son of God. And Jews, obviously, they hated this. So if you wanted to pay the temple tax, if you wanted to make a donation to the temple, what did you do? Well, you had to change your money, and you had to change your money for Jewish money. Is it starting to get a little crazier now? If you were a Jew living at that time and you were not from Jerusalem or the surrounding area, you didn't have the Jewish money. You had the money that was the blasphemous money, the money that was depicting Caesar as God. And so your money, when you finally got to the temple, it wasn't any good. But you had to get in. You had to pay the temple tax. So what did you do? Well, for all of the foreigners, there was conveniently a money changer right there at the temple. And he was happy to take your foreign money and give you Jewish money instead. And the trade rate? Yeah, it was basically extortion. Are you getting it yet? This is kind of like you wanted to go to church for Easter. You're excited to go to Easter. Maybe you're wearing a little bit nicer of a plaid shirt than you normally wear. You go to church and you find out that the parking lot, it's kind of in bad shape. And so the church has said, hey, to come in for Easter, you have to make a donation. You have to tithe on the spot as an entrance fee. you think it's kind of weird, but you were planning on tithing anyway. So you go into the front, you don't have cash, but the church has provided an ATM. Great. Thank you, Pastor. So you go to the ATM, and as you slip in your debit card, you have to hit a button that authorizes the church to process the fee with a $50 surcharge. Yeah, you know what you might feel like doing? I don't know, knocking over the ATM right there. That's exactly what Jesus did.
Serenity now! Serenity now!
Jesus sees people coming in to celebrate a festival, and they are met with people who are trying to turn religion, they're trying to turn their love for God into a for-profit enterprise. And Jesus, he hates it. He throws those guys out, and you and I would do the same. This isn't the case of Jesus being crazy. This isn't the case of Jesus being a social protester. This was Jesus, the Son of God, throwing people out of his own home. When Jesus said that the temple was his Father's house, Jesus is claiming to be God. God is driving people out of his own house who are trying to turn it into a business. They're trying to take money from foreigners and poor people. Jesus is protecting the neglected. But it gets worse. In the 4th century, St. Jerome writes about this, and he gives us a lot of background. You see, money was not the only thing going on there. Did you see the other thing? It was animals, specifically doves. In order to get in order to make a sacrifice, you not just paid the temple tax, you also offered an animal to the temple. And if you were traveling from far away, do you think you wanted to take a dove with you? You probably had a donkey or a horse or something. Did you want to take a dove too? No. So the temple capitalists, they had a solution. They said, we're going to sell the animals that people are going to give to us. Do you see any sort of conflict of interest there? Jerome writes that this happened. The temple sold the doves to some vendors. The vendors sold the doves to the poor people. And then the poor people donated those doves back to the temple. And then the temple sold them to the vendors. The temple, they didn't just have their own money, they were printing their own money. And Jesus is furious. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say, how do you think they paid for those animals? Yeah, with the money from the temple. Yeah, the Jewish money. Are you ready to break something yet? Are you ready to knock something down? Because I am. When Jesus does this, the cleansing of the temple, Jesus is not making a social or political statement. He's making an even bigger one. He's saying that God and greed are incompatible. Religion is not for profit. If anything, religion is for loss. Religion is for anti-profit. L. Ron Hubbard, the guy who created Scientology, he was a famous sci-fi author before, and he told his wife, religion is the only way to make money, because that's the only way the government won't take your money out of taxes. Well, you know what's an even better way to make money? Make your own money. That's what was going on, and that's why Jesus was so angry. Jesus was driving out the sin that was happening inside the temple. So in a world experiencing protests and riots, and when buildings are on fire, what are Christians to do? George Floyd was murdered, and I am totally embarrassed to say, when I saw it, I thought that it was something that happened in the past because those murders have become something so common in America. And I was wrong. So now that I've understood what's going on, now that I see what's going on in the news, what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? Should we go out and join the riot? Should we go out and join the protest? Should we drive people away? Well, that's really not what Jesus did. The murder of Floyd had nothing to do with Jesus driving people out of the temple. Those are two separate situations. Instead, something that Jesus said very early on in his ministry tells us how we should treat the people who are oppressing, how we should treat the people who are attacking. And if we understand the history, it actually makes the story even better.
Take my word for it, there's a moral to this story.
Yeah, it looked like a coronation for Tonche Pepio. He's getting the crowd. He wants the crowd to cheer his performance, and at the end he gets pipped. He gets pipped by Marin Simon of Washington. And you just can't do this kind of stuff, Lewis.
You can, and you know you...
The phrase, go the extra mile, it's become a cliche, and it's lost pretty much all of the original meaning when Jesus made that phrase. We've turned it into something like, work extra hard, or go a little bit further, but that's not at all what it meant. If we look at the history, Jesus was saying something crazy, something extreme. When Jesus told people to go the extra mile, he said this during the Sermon on the Mount. This was a sermon to normal people. This sermon is great. It's very agreeable. Jesus is not preaching to those evil people who are printing their own money. Jesus is speaking to normal people, and these normal people have been annexed. They've been taken over by the Roman Empire. In 1765, the British Parliament passed a Quartering Act, which made it so everyone in the American colonies had to house British troops if there was no room. They also had to feed them. And as you can imagine, Americans, they didn't like doing that. There's still an amendment in the Constitution that prevents the government from making you do this. But in Jesus' time, they had the exact same thing. The Roman soldiers that had taken over Jerusalem, that had taken over Israel, they could force anybody to carry all of their equipment for 1 mile. That equipment, it could weigh up to 100 pounds, and it was the law. You couldn't say no. You had to carry it for 1 mile. And Jesus said, carry it for 2. When Jesus says go the extra mile, he's not saying just write one more TPS report. He's not saying just bench one more rep or set or whatever it is. I don't bench. Jesus is not saying do one more thing. Jesus is saying if an occupying soldier who has oppressed you and your culture forces you by law to help him longer than you have to. That is crazy. That's insane. And that's Jesus. One sentence later, Jesus says this: "You heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for people who persecute you." When Jesus says this to the people that heard this sermon, Jesus isn't saying love your enemies in a general sense. And it wasn't received that way. They aren't thinking of their enemies as the annoying girl at school who sleeps all the time but makes better grades than you. That's not who first century Jews would have thought of as their enemies. When Jesus said the word enemy, when people heard the word enemy, they were thinking of one person, one kind of person, anyone from Rome. They were the enemy. When Jesus says love your enemy, Jesus is saying love that evil pagan empire who has taken away your land and taken away your freedom. And pray for them too. That is crazy, and that is Jesus. In most of the stuff that I've seen, it really looks like the police are in the wrong, that the police could be the enemy, that the police, that the government, that the military that's coming in, they could be the enemy that's like the Roman soldier. I saw a video where the police arrested the reporters that were reporting on the scene. That is awful, and that is as un-American as you can get. I think that Americans, and especially oppressed people groups, are completely justified in their anger. But here's the problem, and I don't say this with a happy attitude. I say this really sad. Our anger is not going to change the police. Our anger is not going to change the military, and we know that our anger is not going to change the government, because the military, the police, and the government, they're not the root problem. Evil, racism, and oppression are the problems. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe, to answer the question, that Christians should be peacefully protesting. I believe that Christians should be cleaning up the cities, and more than all of that, I believe that Black Lives Matter. But I don't think that any sort of social unrest will save us. I don't think that there's a threshold of protesting or rioting where all of a sudden the person, the group, the society that has been oppressing people for 400 years goes, oh wait, actually, they're right. It takes something radical to change the heart of an evil person. It takes something radical to change the heart of systematic oppression. It takes loving your enemies. It takes going the extra mile. It takes forgiveness. It takes Jesus.